Okay, so we've got to go deep on this one. PSSR. Obviously, in the pre-launch period for PlayStation 5 Pro, we got to see a bunch of games, and PSSR was looking very, very promising. But there was always the caveat that there would be different implementations for different games, quality would vary, and crucially, we needed to see games that were rendering at low resolutions, 1080p or lower. We've now seen a lot of these games. We've seen various implementations, and it's clear that there are some issues. So we've got some excellent implementations, some of which we've seen already, and we've also had some shockingly poor implementations to the point where you wonder how they shipped. It's like, it's so problematic and so visible that it shouldn't have actually gone out to consumers in that way. Um, Oliver, you've been doing a lot of work on this. Tested a big bunch of games at this point. Where do we begin with this one?
To me, the overall takeaway from what I have seen thus far in games that use PSSR, and I've sampled all of them pretty much, and I've reviewed a few of them, and I've taken capture of a lot of them. I think PSSR does a good job in general with like less demanding upscale scenarios, less demanding content. That to me is the general takeaway. Like in Last of Us Part 1, which I just took a look at, you have high-res rendering, full-res post-processing, a good frame rate and light maps instead of RTGI or other ray-traced lighting effects. It's kind of a perfect combination of factors there, and the results are good. Like, it's quite comparable to native 4K rendering, in my opinion. It's maybe not quite there in some respects, a little bit better in other respects, but quite comparable overall. When you dial up the content complexity, like in Alan Wake 2 or Silent Hill 2 or Jedi Survivor, push down the input resolution, you start to see less flattering results. They might be better than FSR or TSR. They might be worse. They're kind of in that range typically, except in some exceptional scenarios, I would say, which would probably be okay for a high-res game, a high-res title. But in those instances, you're really hoping for better image quality there. But there are some exceptional games, I would say, like Silent Hill 2 and Jedi Survivor, where it's like they have kind of unusual problems with their ray-traced lighting. And they're kind of broadly worse than the old anti-aliasing they had before. And there's also Dragon's Dogma 2, which has some issues with the RT there that are a little bit unique, but on the whole, it's not as bad as those other two games. Perhaps that comes down to implementations, though. Like, you look at the RT reflections in Silent Hill 2 there, it's so great, but the RT reflections in Spider-Man 2 or Ratchet and Clank or Miles Morales or whatever, those titles have really good RT reflections. Alan Wake 2 has pretty good, a lot better than Silent Hill 2 looking RT reflections as well with PSSR, so it's not like, I don't think it's necessarily an inherent characteristic of the technique. Likewise, RTAO and Spider-Man 2 and Ratchet looks pretty good. In Veilguard, not as much, so there's probably a strong element here of the quality of the implementation, exactly how you're presenting that to PSSR in terms of getting that final image that you want. So yeah, ultimately, I think PSSR has quite a bit of room to improve here. Certainly relative to DLSS, I did some comparisons in The Last of Us Part 1, and it's not quite there. For sure it's not quite there. It does a good job, but it's not there for sure. There are some elements where it does a similar job to DLSS, like with hair cards, does pretty similar work there. Disocclusion certainly is not an issue, really, with PSSR. It tends to slightly blur the area that's just been disoccluded, instead of making it all salt and peppery like FSR. So there's some characteristics of it that look more similar to those AI solutions than the old analytical solutions, the hand-written solutions. But, there's some good implementations right now, mostly having to do with games that, again, a little bit less in the ray tracing in terms of the lighting, although there are some exceptions like Spider-Man for sure, and that are targeting a little bit higher internal resolutions. But that kind of like really extreme upscale factors a lot of developers are pushing right now. It's a little bit tougher in some games, but I would also stress that like Silent Hill 2 and Jedi Survivor, those games really are, in my mind, clearly the worst of the bunch that I've seen so far, and those should not be taken as representative of the general trajectory of PSSR. So overall, I think it's a pretty decent showing so far. The trajectory, I hope, will be pretty good on this technology. But so far, it does kind of vary on a game-to-game basis, but mostly it's pretty decent. It's just when you start to push it really hard that you see some slightly less than ideal results, I'd say.
So we've got outliers. We've got games that sort of do seem to be, I'd say, properly implemented, but are showing the limitations of the technology. Did you check out Star Wars Outlaws? I don't think we've had a look at that one yet.
I have played Star Wars Outlaws. I've captured some of it. To me, at least, I mean, Star Wars Outlaws on console, especially in the performance mode, the RTGI and RT reflections look very, very noisy. In the quality mode, they're a lot better. So on PS5 Pro, all you get is basically a 1440p targeting, at least to my eyes, what looks like a 1440p targeting, basically performance mode equivalent with similar ray tracing settings, it looks like. So it is very noisy relative to that old quality mode, and they don't offer you a toggle at all on PS5 Pro. That to me seemed like the central issue, or at least the central concern there. Image quality overall was not very good, I would say, but was it worse than FSR? Comparing them, I did kind of like some back-to-back comparisons, and to me it seemed pretty comparable. I did notice in some outdoor areas that there were some issues with the foliage, but there were issues with the foliage with FSR as well, so I don't know. It's just a hard game in terms of content, and especially with that really noisy RTGI and RT reflections, I think you aren't getting a great result there on almost anything, really, unless you really bump up those settings. So that'd be my concern at the moment. But perhaps there are some visual glitches, sort of like we see in Jedi Survivor. I've seen people post some issues there. So perhaps in some instances you do see some really strange results with like foliage flickering and things like that.
Okay, so going back to Tom's video on Silent Hill 2, that was quite interesting in that we had access to the disc copy of the game, which basically runs old PlayStation 5 code under boost mode, game boost, so to speak, which basically means that any enhancements the developer would have made would be stripped out and you would simply get acceleration for an old version of the base PlayStation 5 game. And it did seem to be more stable there. That was quite illuminating and slightly concerning, really. I don't know what you make of that, Alex.
Well, I would say for the version of Unreal they were using, Unreal Engine 5.1, the way the reflections and lighting tie, the noise in them ties into TSR is the way they were designed. And it running at higher resolutions then, like it would off of the disc, due to dynamic resolution scaling on a PlayStation 5 Pro with using that same code, would just produce better results. I am not wholly shocked that PS5 Pro's PSSR has had issues with a certain variety of effects, and especially in Silent Hill 2, where earlier versions of Unreal Engine just were designed mainly around TSR and not around other upscalers. But it is a little bit concerning, I think, that we do see some like cross-title similarities in issues, which for me, with a title like Jedi Survivor and Silent Hill 2, I think we've both seen comms or PR on social media or elsewhere saying that, yes, we're aware of the issues in these games, which I have no idea why the patches were put out if the issues are so blatant. But those are instances where the developer will maybe go in, maybe they'll not use PSSR, maybe they'll change it. Who knows what they'll do if they end up repatching those games that have issues. But for the games where there's issues and the developer does not end up repatching the game and it just kind of stays that way, I'm really curious to see what the future is there, because a game like Alan Wake 2, for example, I wouldn't want that image quality for an eternity for Alan Wake 2, right?
Right.
It doesn't have DRS or anything like that. I wouldn't want the game to look that way forever. So I would wonder if a game like that wasn't patched, what happens? Does it just look that way on PS6 and PS7 in the future? That would kind of suck. I would really love it if Sony came out with their stance on how PSSR is going to be updated over time. They've been a little bit coy in talking about the technicals in the public space in released information so far, but it would be really interesting to know if, like on PC with XeSS or DLSS, where you can just plug in the new DLL into a game and get a lot of the benefits, almost sometimes transformative benefits for older versions, if something like that is also going to be happening for PlayStation 5 Pro and PS6 for that matter, because an older model of a machine learned upscaler could have issues like we're seeing right now, but a later one might not, and it might fix them. In which case, it would be great if the user had, much like any of the other options in the video menu there on the PlayStation 5 Pro, an optional tick, upgrade PSSR model or something like that. It wouldn't have to be forced or something like that, but just something the user can do with a, here be dragons kind of warning. I think that would be great for the future because right now some of the implementations really leave a lot to be desired, especially for something, that should be just per se better than the previous model. And that would be great for users.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You also took a look at Black Ops quickly because Tom's doing a video on that. And we also have PSSR implemented on Black Ops as well, which is kind of interesting from my perspective because the amount of iteration and refinement that's gone into Infinity Ward's own solution pretty much since Infinite Warfare at this point. I'd be really surprised if, suddenly a machine learning model came out of the blue and just produced better results. I mean, it'd be great if so, but I'm curious what you thought about it.
I thought it actually was leaving a lot to be desired there. There's the issue that people are talking about online about the speckling, and that is there. It seems to be like specularity because Tom has a couple of examples of it, but just seems to be like rogue highlights from materials that just get caught up as one pixel and not filtered out like a Firefly filter would do, which sometimes doesn't even come from something like TAA. It's something that's pre-TAA sometimes. And there were other issues there too, like regarding thin geometry, thin transparencies, as well as small scale patterns that, like from a larger scale started to get moire in them. So things that would just not look as good as the previous TAA because that wasn't compared to some sort of perfect anti-aliasing or something like that. And in a case like that, it is a little bit odd to see the old version looking better in aspects, even though, once again, the hardware is way better in PS5 Pro on the GPU side of things, which is the thing that matters most. So yeah, I don't think it acquitted itself very well in that title in comparison to what it did. And I once again imagine that would be a great title where future versions of PSSR could just be retroactively applied to it. Another thing I thought, like you just mentioned, Rich, is that game on console specifically is doing a whole lot sub-native shading. They have a software VRS solution which is going to be degrading individual patches of pixels. I think the smallest is like a 2x2 patch. It can degrade like that level of granularity, which is better than hardware VRS in that aspect. And they're also probably doing like sub-native transparency as well too, if we look at the previous titles they've done in the past. And they're also doing temporal upscaling usually with like I think half horizontal or half vertical sometimes. Tom's covered this before.
It seems to vary according to the title, according to the version. But it seems capable of doing both. But on PS5 and Xbox Series X, it does seem to be horizontal scaling.
Horizontal scaling. So yeah, the way the scaling is done is also not necessarily like static axis scaling. And all those things I think are just not exactly plug and play for upscaling in general. They would have to be really fine-tuned to get it working. A lot of games that use VRS still do not have it so that TAA reconstructs a degraded VRS tile. So this is something that I don't like about variable rate shading, is that even if you sit still in an image, you can see that TAA is not reconstructing the broken down like texture quality, and it still looks like, like nearest neighbor filtered textures that are just, not good looking. And I would imagine PSSR probably has trouble with that because most things would. In which case, yeah, the fact that their native upscaler does a lot of things better is a question of QA and a question of implementation as well too. But yeah, that was not too great looking. So when I read subjective things online, people are always saying like, wow, this looks so good. Like Oliver was just talking about Star Wars Outlaws. People are talking about like, wow, this looks so good. And I'm just like looking at like the media I see. I'm like, this doesn't look so good. So be wary of subjective takes you see online, I always feel.
Yeah. There is a certain element to it where I think people just boot up the PS5 Pro and they just assume whatever I'm seeing on screen, that is the ideal form of this game. But actually, if you use your more objective senses and you actually do some comparisons, or even if you just look at the issues in the game like Star Wars Jedi Survivor, you see pretty quickly, I think, that there are substantial issues. And I kind of wonder exactly how much of a degraded image you could present to those users, and they'd still think, oh, this is a great image. It does make me lose my faith a little bit in the opinions of the peanut gallery there.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah, there's been some fascinating discourse online about the capabilities of the PS5 Pro and how, suddenly, the Matrix Awakens is running at 60 frames per second. It's really not. The cutscenes are still capped to 24. The game is still locked to 30. The CPU issues when you hit another car is still there. It's plain as day. But going back to a point you made, Alex, about a system-level toggle to integrate the latest version of PSSR. The pushback against that would be that the developers want control of how their titles look, right? That's always been the sort of argument that gets produced whenever there's a new version of an upscaler that we can't adapt to an older version of a game. I don't think I've ever seen any specific examples of how it's actually, a new version has actually made a game look worse. But more to the point, we already have a toggle within PlayStation 5 Pro, which enables you to add what looks like a machine learning based post-process upscale to basically any PlayStation 4 game that has a 1080p output.
Right.
There's no difference, basically, is there? We've already crossed the boundary in terms of taking over image quality from the developer. So the concept of having a system level toggle to integrate the best or the latest version of PSSR with, as you say, a Hubie Dragon's disclaimer, I think that's fair game, right?
Yeah, I would love it. It wouldn't be too different than what we see with that, as well as, a variety of the other things. You can on Xbox run the game in a 120 hertz container for games that they never thought of that, obviously. And I find that another great positive aspect of a larger repertoire of options that a console can give you. And this could just be one of those options.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Let's take some supporter questions here, because I've got to say, last week I'd say 20% of the questions were about PSSR issues. This week I'd say it's closer to 30 to 40% of the questions. So it's definitely an issue that's concerning people. This one from Afreem the Dream. Greetings, Valduman! ! Do you see PSSR getting significantly better over the next few years, or is the PS5 Professional just a years-long beta test for PS6's implementation of PSSR? Darth Plagius the Unwise. Good day, gents! ! I'd like to know if you think PSSR is something that can be updated with a patch. I imagine Sony is collecting a lot of data from PS5 Pro consoles to help iterate on PSSR. Perhaps they could patch PSSR to help with the film grain look some games seem to suffer from, such as Alan Wake 2. Oliver, what do you think about this? I mean, my point about the Freeing the Dreams question here, which is, years-long beta test, in a sense, yes, because machine learning is crucial to the future of gaming. So, obviously there are going to be teething problems with, a nascent technology, so to speak, right?
Yeah, I mean, in some sense, I think the PS5 Pro is probably preparing for the PS6 in terms of the technologies they're bringing to the table. In terms of PSSR in particular, obviously, in this case, I think PSSR at the moment, in the titles where it's doing a good job, I think it's a very, very good solution. Even in the titles where it's doing a bad job, it's usually like a pretty acceptable upscaler relative to what we had previously in those games, which was FSR. Generally, it's usually not, it's kind of up there in terms of quality at least. So I wouldn't call it a beta test. I think it will get better, though, from speaking to developers at the event a couple months ago. There certainly were some issues with early versions of PSSR that got ironed out. There were performance improvements as well. And so I think that overall, the trajectory is certainly there in terms of getting it up to the level of quality they want. Although I will say that some of the issues I was privy to at that event back in September did ship with those final games in titles like Dragon's Dogma 2, issues I noted at the preview, issues I talked about in the initial preview video I did with Rich. Those issues did ship. So perhaps those titles were not iterated on, or perhaps there were not new versions of PSSR past a certain point there. In terms of it being updated with a patch, yeah, I mean, a title update to the game could update PSSR. But the question is really whether games could be updated on a basis independent of title updates. I think that's a question that we don't have an answer to at the moment. But it would be cool if you could do that, or indeed if you could toggle it through some kind of selection in the menus, as was previously stated. I think that would be cool, because that would offer a little bit of flexibility there and hopefully free you from having to deal with a title like Alan Wake 2 in that state for an eternity, as Alex put it. You could hopefully get some improvement there on a future system, or just with some time spent on the upscale process improving there.
Yeah, I mean, eternity is a pretty long time.
Yeah. Yeah.
This question from Peter Karadimas, Alex. How comparable is PSSR to the early days of DLSS? Should we expect the same overall quality trajectory? Well, surely the answer is, well, we can't expect the same overall quality trajectory, but we should expect a quality trajectory.
Yeah, I mean, it should. I mean, if they're training the game, comparability to DLSS 2.0 is a bit of a, doesn't really bring us anywhere. The difference is DLSS 2.0, its issues were actually about kind of the exact opposite of PSSR's. PSSR seems to not hold on to information nearly long enough as it should at times. Like, that's why it's like the static image is jittering and has noise instead of resolving anti-aliasing. I feel like DLSS 2.0, and I'm talking about 2.0 as implemented in Wolf Youngblood, as well as like Control's like second patch, because the original version of Control actually had a analytical approximation of DLSS, which I called DLSS 1.9. Which was a lot more like FSR 2.0 actually. That actually had the issue more so of holding on to information too long. So you could see like trails behind someone in a dark environment, for example. That was like 2.0's issue, and that got resolved fully, I would say, around DLSS 2.5.1. And then since then, it's been pretty sweet. But coming back to PSSR, which has nothing to do with that, I would expect there to be iteration time and it getting better over time. The one thing they really need to do, though, is make sure that that's why it is a little bit rocky, I think, because Sony is just like one smaller company who doesn't have an entire like fleet of people and server infrastructure that are designed around machine learning necessarily, in comparison to someone like NVIDIA, whose entire business model has moved over to that almost. And that's where they need to cast a wide net here and get as much data from as variety of scenarios and titles as possible, including titles using ray tracing. That may take quite a long time, actually.
Yeah, I think, on an overall sense, it's you're basically pitching a nascent technology, a first generation version of machine learning upscaling, up against some pretty established upscalers. FSR and TSR have basically had years worth of updates at this point. The extent to which the quality is improved is clearly variable, but it's still, the bottom line is that there's a lot more experience with those techniques. And obviously there was a post, I'm not sure which, maybe recent era, but apparently there are many versions of PSSR in circulation, which wouldn't surprise me at this point. And it's, getting better all the time. So I do think it's just a case of wait and see almost, but there are already, as Oliver says, we've got these kind of outliers, which are really, really poor. In fact, we got this question here from Mr. Burns. I'm quite baffled by the poor results of PSSR in Alan Wake 2, Silent Hill 2, and Jedi Survivor, but I'm even more baffled why the developers of these games would send out a patch like that. Are they not seeing what we are seeing, or possibly other factors at play? Well, it is early technology, and there's also the fact that a lot of these studios are actually quite resource constrained. If you think about the actual amount of money they're going to make by actually implementing a PlayStation 5 Pro upgrade, it's probably quite minimal. The amount of resource that can be allocated to that is therefore going to be relatively small. So, there are going to be cases where things just don't go to plan. That's unfortunately the reality of A, limited budgets, and B, first generation technology.
Yeah.
So, I do expect that there will be improvements there. But Mr. Burns also talks about what we've discussed already, manually replacing the PSSR at the system level. But, that's all down to Sony and the developers at the end of the day. Oliver, any final thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a good question. I think in general, I am seeing some issues with QA in certain titles. I think we do see that, especially with like the proliferation of certain modes in certain games. And also, this is a bit of a tangent, but with the naming schemes on the Pro modes, because we have everything from like Pro mode to PS5 Pro mode to Quality mode, Performance Pro, all kinds of different names there, which is a little bit silly to me. I think that Sony should adopt some standardized naming practice and tell developers to use it, as well as possibly providing some guidance on the PSSR side in terms of resolutions and when to use it, when not to use it, how to use it. I'm sure they do provide some guidance, but probably not sufficient there, in my opinion, or at least it's not being taken. In terms of Alan Wake 2, Silent Hill 2, Jedi Survivor, especially Jedi Survivor and Silent Hill 2, I think it probably is just a matter of like you have a couple engineers working on it for a relatively short period of time, perhaps. And there are some issues in particular with ray traced lighting in some of those games where, and also like emissive materials and things like that, where maybe you're running into some problems where you need some extra engineering resources and you need some extra QA time to actually sort out those issues. And you're not getting it. Certainly when I spoke to developers back in September, there was some mention of like, oh, we had this issue, we had that issue, we had this issue. But eventually we sorted it out and we got a good result, needing to iterate a little bit to get a good result out of PSSR potentially. So perhaps that's just the case here where they're not getting that iteration time. QA department is approving something that they probably shouldn't, and you end up with a result visually that's not a very attractive result ultimately.
It's also interesting that two Sony games that we're aware of, Gran Turismo 7 and God of War, actually have a toggle for PSSR. You can actually turn it on or off in favor of TAAU, I presume, which is quite interesting. The fact that a Sony first-party studio would effectively allow the user to opt out of PSSR, I think it's quite intriguing. And maybe that's a potential route forward. I think it would definitely have been good for example, Call of Duty, where the upscaler is so deeply embedded in the whole rendering process. Also interesting is that Fortnite has shipped with a Pro patch. They have tapped into the hardware ray tracing features of the Pro, but they haven't used PSSR. They've stayed with TSSR, perhaps for the reasons you stated earlier, Alex.
Right,
that,
yeah.
Basically, the engine is built around that particular upscaler, therefore it would produce the most optimal results. So, yeah, I think it is basically, the whole discussion can be labelled work in progress. There's a lot more to do. But certainly some of the results we've seen have been quite extraordinarily good. And some not so good.